My husband's ex makes him believe that I was pregnant with my stepbrother, so he asked me for a divorce abortion. But after 10 years he wants to see his son, and I have bad news for him. My husband's ex completely manipulated him to make him believe that I was cheating on him. But things got much worse. She convinced him that the person I supposedly cheated on him with was my stepbrother, and that I was pregnant with him. I would never be unfaithful to him, and much less with my stepbrother. He didn't believe me, so I ended up leaving him. But now he wants to see his son, so that you have a reference. And also for me, because I'm not going to use real names here, and I want to keep a record of the fake names. I choose the people involved in this story are the following: me, 35 years old, GR 38 years old, my current husband Sebastian, my stepbrother, Ephra, my ex-husband, almost in his 30s. I don't know exactly his age, ex-wife from Ezra before we met. I'm going to try to keep this as clear as possible, but this is a combination of an anxious seeking for advice and an angry venting that I don't want to take out on anyone else. So even if you're just here to read about the horrible lives of strangers and you're not going to leave any advice, feel free to read. I hope I can do justice to the summary of one of the worst times of my life before I get too sidetracked with the background. Here's the summary of the current situation. I just found out my ex-husband has been asking about me after almost a decade of silence because he wants to see me and my son. Maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal when written in one sentence, but I hope as you read on, you can understand why this news has caused me such an emotional buzz. When I was 24, my best friend and I moved across the country to a new city and a new state to start our adult lives. Half a year later, she was offered her dream job in our hometown, and of course I encouraged her to take it. Unfortunately, that meant I was left alone in a new city and a new state. 2 weeks after she left, I met Ezra. I was alone with no friends and stressed out about my new job. He had just broken up with his teenage girlfriend, and all of that combined to form a very intense relationship within a few weeks of meeting him. He practically lived in my apartment, and I was convinced he was the love of my life. He was in his last semester of college after changing majors several times, and was ready to start working at his father's engineering company, half an hour from the city. Maybe he was starting to see a future in that city. Now looking back, the cracks were evident from the beginning. Hindsight is much clearer than foresight. And so when his graduation came and his ex-girlfriend showed up with her mother, I just smiled, introduced myself, and tried to make a good impression on her family. She was almost friends with the family, which was to be expected, considering how long they had been together before the breakup, but she was basically the classic girl next door. Their mothers were best friends, so they had grown up together, and they told me that the day they started dating was the best day in Ezra's mother's life. Even so, I was young, naive, and in love, so I put up with it. I sat next to her and did my best to get along with her mother. She never really accepted me, but I never stopped trying. She almost became a constant presence in my life. From that moment on, Ezra would tell me that it was hard for him to cut contact with her because of how close their families were. So I tried to understand. It didn't matter that I clung to her arm at every event, or that I would call him by every pet name in the world. We would come home to our apartment, because it quickly became home for both of us, and he would tell me that he loved me and I believed him. He just didn't want to hurt his family by leaving Kai aside. I mean, how could I complain when I also love my family with all my heart? I would do anything for them, so I could certainly understand him. Wanting to protect his mother's feelings 8 months into our relationship, he proposed to me. I now know he did it the same day he found out I almost had a new boyfriend at the time. However, I was blinded by love and gladly accepted, even though there was no ring. I thought he wanted to propose to me so badly, I couldn't wait to get one a year later. I walked down the aisle happy to marry him. Back then, I thought my wedding to Ezra would be the best day of my life. I hadn't seen my family in months, and suddenly everyone was in the same room celebrating. I was so excited catching up with them and introducing them, considering that, up to that point, the only member of my family that Ezra had met was my stepbrother, who had visited me a few months ago. You know, I didn't even care that she almost showed up in a white dress, or that she danced almost as much with him as I later excused it, thinking that Ezra was just celebrating that special day with his lifelong friend. After all, I had also danced with my best friend and my stepbrother, the two closest people to me, besides Ezra. That was what I did throughout my marriage with him. I ignored the warning signs and justified his actions. Especially in regards to respectability that day, Ezra was all I had. True, all the friendships I had made in that city were related to him or us as a couple, and all family relationships were maintained through him. My family lived in another state hours away, and Ezra was never willing to make that trip. All I had was him. Then I got pregnant to clear any doubts. There was no abuse or anything like that, in a way that would have been easier of explaining to my family and friends. What finally made me open my eyes and realize how much I almost influenced their life was the fact that he truly believed that I was pregnant with my stepbrother's child. Take a moment to process how absurd that is. Ezra truly believed that the baby I was carrying in my womb was not his, but that I had been unfaithful to him. With Sebastian, my stepbrother, since I lived in another city far from home, and our relationship before marriage had not been that long. Sebastian and Ezra had only met each other once before the wedding, when Sebastian visited me at the beginning of the relationship. The second time they met was at our wedding a year and a half after we got married. I flew to my hometown to celebrate my mother's 60th birthday. Ezra did not want to accompany me on that trip. A month later, I found out I was pregnant. I thought Ezra would be happy. He had always talked about wanting a large family with lots of kids, and we had friends and family willing to support us, but instead of being happy, the first thing she said was, this would happen. It's been almost 10 years, and I still remember it with total clarity. I was completely confused. The only explanation she gave me was she warned me and I should have believed her. Instead of being happy, she left the apartment that same night and didn't answer any of my calls or messages. When she came back the next morning, she gave me two options: abortion or divorce, to spare you the details. When I finally got her to explain to me what was going on, it turned out that I had almost been filling his head with lies. Apparently, during our wedding, she convinced him that Sebastian and I were behaving little snippets of our relationship that she saw on social media, since Sebastian lived in another state. But that didn't stop her later when I traveled alone to see him and came back pregnant. That was all I needed to convince Ezra that I was cheating on him. I obviously denied all of the accusations that Ezra believed, because of it was almost true. Sebastian was practically like a twin brother to me. In the fact that it would be impossible, the accusation was not only absurd, but deeply offensive. But that didn't matter to A.E. Ray. He didn't care when I offered to take a paternity test. He didn't care when I showed him the medical reports that indicated I was already pregnant before traveling. He didn't care, even when I was breaking down, and the lack of shared property made the process fast. Ezra also refused any paternity testing and therefore signed a document waiving any rights to our unborn child. I haven't heard from him since, and now I find out that he is looking for me and his child. My concerns are as follows. My current husband GR barely knows anything about Ezra or about how my previous relationship ended, knows that I was married and it didn't end well. But that's all. It's just a matter of time before Ezra figures out a way to contact me. What am I supposed to do when that happens? Maybe it's not as bad as I'm imagining, and if it is, don't hesitate to tell me, but I'm panicking a little. It's a chapter of my life that I thought was completely closed, and I don't want to reopen it. Update 1 with the intention of not attracting more attention than I already have. I'll try to be even more vague with the details of this situation and all the people involved. Maybe using the word observer is overkill given what's happened so far, which I admit hasn't been much. 2 days after an old friend warned me that my ex-husband was trying to contact me. I received follow requests on all my social media, although he hasn't messaged me yet, because I haven't accepted no requests. I'm afraid it won't be long before they start coming in. I've even been looking at my LinkedIn profile, which I can see, because the platform shows who visited your page RFEL. It is clear that he sought me out on purpose. I managed to gather strength and talk to my husband GR about everything I mentioned in my previous post. I told him the whole story about my relationship with Ezra, about almost everything I put up with from him and his family, and finally about his reaction to my pregnancy. Luckily, the man I am married to today is 1,000 times better than my ex. He was understanding, attentive, and gave me all his support. As I told him this endless story, when I finished, he cared more about finding a way to comfort me than the fact that I had never told him this before. Of course. Right at that moment was when the follow-up requests intensified. We talked about what to do and decided to block all his accounts on each of the platforms where he found me, which were practically all the ones I have. He had been watching every corner of my online life. Luckily, all my accounts are private. I thought that blocking him would give me some peace of mind. But it was then that the messages started to come in. He created fake accounts to send me private messages on almost every platform in them. He said that he had made a mistake, that he wanted to see me, and that he wanted to meet his son. All the messages were different, but in the end they said the same thing. He was not going to stop contacting me until I allowed him to see his son. He assured me that the child deserved to meet his real father and that having a biological father was better than a stepfather. He claimed that I could not understand him because, according to him, he had always thought that in-law relationships were the same as blood relations. The more I ignored him, the longer his messages became insisting that I had the right to see his son. He wrote that he would continue to create new accounts and that I could not block him forever. I have no doubt that he will continue to try to contact me. I just hope that sending longer messages is the only thing he does to escalate this situation. He has assured me that we are completely safe and Kezra is not going to do anything really dangerous, but I have a bad feeling about all of this. Update 2 showed up at my mother's house. My ex-husband, who I had not seen in practically 10 years, sat on my mother's doorstep because she wouldn't respond to his texts. I visit my mother every Saturday without fail, unless something important comes up. I always take my son with me, but since Friday night he had stayed the night at a friend's house. This time, I went alone in the morning. I didn't notice the car parked across the street or the man who was sitting in the driver's seat, at least not until I parked in the driveway and got out of the car. It was then that he also got out of his car and walked towards me, understandably. I stood in and felt scared seeing a man standing next to me, but when I recognized him, the fear didn't go away. He was out from my mother's house, a place he never visited during our marriage, a place he never bothered to go. His response, "What are you doing here?" was the same as in his messages. He wanted to see his son. He had tracked me across the country, apparently finding the address through shipments of my belongings when I moved alone, because I wanted to see his son. The same son he once believed was not his. I don't know if I was stupid or brave, but in that moment, I stopped being afraid, and anger filled me. I didn't care that he had found my mother's address. I didn't care that we were in the middle of a neighborhood with neighbors known for being nosy, and I didn't care that I was alone with him for the first time since our marriage ended. I screamed at him with everything I had inside, throwing in his face every single thing he did during our relationship. His only defense was that I had almost manipulated him. He told me he was hurt and vulnerable and believed in his lifelong friend. Apparently this all started when he almost got married a few months ago and finally confessed to her that he had been lying all along the moment Ezra found out I had been pregnant with his child. He started looking for me. Luckily, none of our mutual friends would give him my number, so he resorted to finding me on the internet, and when I blocked him everywhere, he had no choice but to find me in person. He told me he was desperate to see his son, but I had bad news for him. He didn't have a son. The stress of his accusations, the divorce, and the move across the country piled up. And just a few months after we split up, he lost the baby. The son he had given up on having was never born. Ezra didn't have a child. My son Spencer is grandson. My stepson, who I adopted as my own, has the same red hair as me, and a personality just as intense because Ezra was right. In one thing, for me, political family relationships are worth as much as blood relationships. I have a son, but he is or not. At that moment, I had already been screaming so hard, loud and so long that my mother and stepfather left the house along with several curious neighbors. I don't know if it was the audience or the shock, but when my stepfather told Ezra that it was best for him to leave, he left without arguing. Maybe I should have told him all this from the beginning instead of blocking him and ignoring his messages. But how was I supposed to know he would show up here? I just hope that now that he knows the truth, he goes back to his life away from me and my family. Update 3. Logically, I should have realized that it wouldn't be that easy to get rid of Ezra. Not after he followed me to the other side of the country, desperate to see a son who doesn't exist. To be honest, when I called him an observer in the previous updates, a part of me did it in a joking tone, trying to feel better about his sudden reappearance in my life. He had followed my steps on every social network where I had an account. But there is a big difference between being a passive bystander and turning back into an active stalker. Apparently, Ezra was more than willing to take that leap. I don't know why I thought he would believe me when I told him that a Spencer was not his son-to-be. Clara, a Spencer is not, nor is he even biologically related to me. Beyond my marriage to his father and my adoption of him, we do not share blood ties. The coincidence that we both have the same red hair color was something that Grant and I called destiny when I decided to adopt a Spencer as my son. However, expecting Eam to believe when the main reason for our divorce was precisely that he refused to believe me was stupid on my part. The truth is, I don't know exactly what I expected from him. Maybe I thought that he would simply accept what I told him and disappear forever, and that I would never have to see him again. After that day at my mother's house, I started to write down his car everywhere. At first I thought he had parked it near my street, but it was just for a moment. So I assumed I was being paranoid the second time. I thought I saw his car. I mentioned it to Gran. From then on, we both started to be more vigilant, and sure enough, his car kept appearing every time we noticed him. He would speed up and leave before we could do anything. 2 weeks of that was enough for us to go to the police. We had taken some pictures of his car in different places, mostly near my mother's house and ours. I thought surely the police would take seriously the fact that we were being watched and followed by my ex-husband, who is convinced my son is his. Surely they would take some action. Apparently not. Although what we presented might seem suspicious, the police told us they couldn't arrest someone just for being near us. We had no proof of that. He had no intention of harming us, nor had he done anything against us directly. So we are alone in all this update 4. I am happy to inform you that my ex-husband will no longer be a problem for me or my family after doing everything possible to convince the police to take preventive measures. Without success, we finally managed to present the necessary evidence to have him arrested. As I mentioned in my previous update, Ezra was hanging around Spencer's school. The conclusion was obvious. He wanted to take the child that he thought was his son. No matter what I wanted. Obviously, neither GR nor I were going to allow that to happen. Luckily, our neighbor, who is a teacher at Spencer's school, shared our concern. It was thanks to her that we managed to get ahead of the facts. We knew that eventually ERA was going to try something. We just had to wait. In the meantime, we informed the school staff about what was going on. We made it clear to everyone in the office that Spencer was not to leave school with anyone other than my neighbor Grantomi, and a few days later it happened in the middle of the day. Ezra walked into the school office saying he was coming to pick up Spencer on my behalf, because an emergency had come up with his grandmother. He even mentioned my mother's name, probably believing that would make it more believable when the staff told him they would have to call me before handing Spencer over. He insisted that I was busy with the emergency, and that I couldn't be bothered. As he failed to convince them, he pretended that he would call me himself, and left the building with that excuse. Obviously, he never called me instead. He sat in his car outside the school waiting. However, the school called me right away and informed me of everything that had happened, just as we had planned. They also recorded the entire interaction on video at the end of the school day. They released the students as usual, but they kept Spencer in their living room with my neighbor. It was then that the police with the video in hand arrived to arrest Ezra while he was in his car. Inside the car, the police found 2 plane tickets to his home state, along with high-potency sedative medication. They believed their plan was to use that medication on Spencer to take him away. Ezra was arrested and will remain in custody until his trial, where he will face charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, endangering a child, and any other charges they can add to it. Finally, our nightmare ended update. CCO. It's been months since my last update. Ezra is in prison. I am not going to detail all the exact charges against him because I don't want anyone to be able to find out his real name and track me through this, but I can say he will be in prison for several years, although I would prefer him to stay there forever. The charges include the ones I mentioned in the previous post. Along with some additional ones, he somehow got out of some charges which makes no sense to me, but as long as he is behind bars, I don't care about trying to justify the sedative saying it was his, which was true, because he had a prescription for them. He had been taking them after he found out the truth. Still, the plane tickets and the whole thing was so disturbing that I might have thought about using them on top of that. We now have restraining orders against him for Gr. Spencer and I, and he will never be able to go near Spencer's school without being arrested during the trial. An official paternity test was taken, which proved once and for all that Spencer is Gr's son. My medical records were also submitted with my consent, confirming that I had a miscarriage a few months after my separation from Ezra, all those years ago. Ezra did all this to end up in prison for absolutely nothing. And you know what the cherry on the cake is? She almost showed up at the trial and made a whole show of pretending to be devastated that Ezra was going to jail. Shortly after her husband left her publicly, it seems she had almost been constantly posting on social media in support of Ezra. On her last post, her husband commented saying that she was free to go support him in jail, as she refused to stop talking about him. Some friends in town have told me that their divorce is already in process. Of course, I have blocked almost all of Ezra's acquaintances on every platform I could think of. I have cut off any chance of ever running into them again. Update 6: Cass and Ezra were together, which many people were thinking in the comments, and I'm not going to deny that I did too, which is why it almost ended in divorce. I don't know if their relationship started while Ezra and I were still married before we got married, or after our separation. But what is clear is that she had almost always wanted to get back with him. The good news for her is that she will now be able to enjoy conjugal visits in jail, and will no longer have to hide from her husband while she does her thing with Ezra. Obviously, it won't be as glamorous as doing it in an expensive hotel, but not everything in life is perfect. No, the most curious thing is that I found out about all this because he almost contacted me by email. He did have the nerve to send me a message full of insults and hurtful comments. As you can imagine, he basically tried to rub it in my face that he had won. Because in the end, thanks to the lies he put in Ezra's head, he stayed with him. I was very tempted to answer him and tell him that he shouldn't feel so proud, because the only thing he got was to stay with a pathetic loser. But the truth is that I wanted to be the most mature person in this situation. That is a lie. I answered him. And of course, after sending my answer, I blocked him. I imagine that he must have sent more emails full of things not suitable for minors, but luckily for me, nobody is going to read them. What a tragedy, true. Anyway, although there could be taken the high road, in the end I couldn't resist dropping that last word. Sometimes being a little immature is the best therapy. Update 7: I just found out something I'm sure is going to leave you mouths open, and I couldn't wait to get home to write it here. Ezra has taken a beating in jail. Don't worry if any of you feel sorry for that gentle soul, he's out of danger. But from what I've been told in jail, they don't look kindly on men who try to kidnap children, so they gave him a special welcome to make him clear what they think of someone like him. As much as Ezra has tried to play the victim all this time, the rules inside jail are very different. There his attempts at manipulation and his attitude of superiority mean nothing, and it seems he's already learned that the hard way possible.